Hey everybody, I'm excited to get back to this Saturday reading with Reverend Wurmbrand on the Answer to the Atheist Handbook. And this is a apologetic book in response to the book that came out in 1961 by Moscow's Academy of Science. And Wurmbrand was imprisoned for looks like around 11 years by the communist world at that time over in Russia. And so he knew this atheistic handbook well, which was taught to Russians and for a whole generation. And so this is his rebuttal book against that. So it's great. It mentions a lot of things that are in our world today or in our thoughts today as a society. So it's really good to read. This last chapter, by the way, if you didn't listen to the last one, man, the last one on the Reverend attacks of the Bible was awesome. I kind of love this quote. Does it count for nothing that Christian missionaries taught the natives of Africa to give up cannibalism, to read, to behave as civilized men? Another quote from Wurmbrand was, an honorable atheist is one who bows before the church in gratitude for what mankind owes to Christianity. But to spit in the well from which you and the whole civilized world have drunk is terribly wrong. And he has some great quotes from atheists of all kind in that chapter, and their thoughts towards Christianity and religion in general, and some were favorable, some weren't so favorable, and then he kind of goes into his rebuttal. So this week, and it's great to be back again, is did the characters in the Bible really exist? And remember, he's speaking from the perspective of correcting the atheistic handbook and what that says. Criticism of the Bible text is a legitimate concern of the human mind. Christian theologians did not need to wait for the advice of atheists to verify biblical history. Reconciling biblical and secular chronicles are chronologies and investigating archaeological data. The fact that we believe in the divine inspiration and the infallibility of scriptures has never prevented us from examining minutely its text and its content. To be very sure we have the words of God inspired them, unmarred by later copyists or translators. The biblical criticism as practiced by our atheist opponents is of an entirely different type. They deny the most important events of the biblical narrative and relegate the principal biblical personalities to the real realm of myth. But the facts of the Bible remain, and science cannot confute them. It is a fact that the archaeologist's shovel always substantiates, never disproves, the biblical narrative. For the atheist and liberal theologians, Adam and Eve are personalities of a myth. There is no valid reason to deny the biblical record that Adam and Eve really lived on earth in the Garden of Eden and were expelled from it, just as we do not uncritically discard other historical records kept by mankind. But our opponents render us a service by calling the story a myth. A myth is not necessarily something unreal, but is, rather, highest reality expressed in images and symbols arising from and appealing to the depths of the human soul. The story of Adam and Eve is more than history. It is history and myth at the same time. Your own lives, my dear opponents, are a reproduction of what happened to Adam and Eve. There has been the innocence of childhood in a world untrammeled with worries and fretting about big problems. Perhaps you remember when intentional sin, trespassing against the moral law you lived by, but first invaded your life, and maybe you hide from God. Later it may have taken the form of hiding some of your autobiography from the public. We should not reproach our first forefathers. If Adam and Eve had not sinned, we would have eaten from the forbidden fruit. Adam and Eve are archetypes of general human experience, of what happens with every soul. Myths cannot be opposed to reality. They are often a deepening of the sense of some isolated fact, showing it to be typical for the whole of mankind. You cannot disregard the value of the Mona Lisa by saying it is only a portrait. It is the portrait of a living being. A portrait is as much a reality as the human being it shows. The Mona Lisa is, in a certain sense, even more real than the person it portrays. It is more beautiful, more permanent. It sums up her best features. It corrects nature. The portrait does not contradict the person. The spiritual sense of Adam and Eve's story does not contradict their being historical beings. What I said about Adam and Eve applies also to the remedy for sin, to the sacrifice of Christ. Every man who has done something wrong seeks a scapegoat, someone he can charge with his own offense. Knowing this psychological law embedded in the sinner, Christ offered himself as the scapegoat. He, being the Son of God, takes the whole responsibility for our entire life, good and evil. He has identified himself with us out of love and has borne our punishment. What he endured in the crucifixion on Golgotha avails us as if we ourselves had passed through all his torments. We are free from sin and guilt because Christ shed his blood for us. Then he rose from the dead, showing us that we who believe in him will also be resurrected to be with him in paradise. His death and resurrection are a historic reality, but the myth about a God who dies as a sacrifice for sin and rises again goes back before Christ. Atheists are correct in reminding us that approximately the same things were believed about the god Horus of the Egyptians or the god of Mithra and others. Unlike Christ, these gods were not historic but archetypical realities. All these, quote, gods were counterfeits of the genuine Redeemer, who had been promised to mankind, and in that sense foreshadowed the coming of Christ. Horus and Mithra and Dionysus were names given to the Savior after whom mankind longed. By the way, if you're interested in that kind of idea, I always recommend the book, The Case for the Real Jesus. I don't know if I have it anywhere. The Case for the Real Jesus by Lee Strobel. He interviews Yamachi, I think it is, out of, I forget what university he's out of, but he's one of the top ancient manuscript professors around that talks about these supposedly resurrection-like stories that were around before Christ. And man, it's a real eye-opener and a real challenge to misunderstandings or misrepresentations, or if you want to call them propaganda, of those ideas that the Christian Christ is just another form of the Egyptian god Mithra or the like. So I'm not going to get into all that, but you can read that, The Case for the Real Jesus by Lee Strobel, if you want to research that and actually maybe blow up some of what you think maybe is true. So we will not worry then if our opponents call Adam and Eve and the Redeemer promised to them after the fall in paradise myth. The flood in Noah's time which destroyed the whole earth. Another legend, atheists say? But the biblical narrative is corroborated by the Chinese, Greek, British, Mexican stories of a deluge. Cuneiform tablets unearthed in Babylonia in 1870 also bore an account of the flood, striking because of its resemblance to the biblical record. Believed to date from 3000 BC, these tablets must have been written when people vividly recall the deluge. Called the Gilgamesh epic, the narrative tells how the hero of the flood escaped the general destruction of mankind. Sorry about that. The great gods of the ancient city of Shuruppak resolved to destroy the race by a flood. I probably butchered that place's name. The god Ea disclosed the divine decree to the main character and saved him from his family. Another story of the flood has been found written in Sumerian, a language that precedes both Assyrian and Babylonian. The renowned anthropologist Sir James Frazer collected traditions about the flood from the most varied and remote places such as the Leeward Islands, Bengal, China, Malaysia. Everywhere peoples and backwards tribes keep the memory of this tremendous event. They agree that the flood was a punishment for grave sins, that only a few righteous people were saved. Josephus Flavius is generally considered one of the most reliable historians of antiquity. He writes in Antiquities of the Jews, quote, "The Armenians call the place where Noah and his family came out of the ark Apobatarian, the place of descent." In the story of the flood, facts and myth merge again. Engraved in the deepest reaches of our mind is the truth that generalized grave sin will result in catastrophe. We know also that there have been many cases when the righteous of a few has miraculously saved them from general destruction. The historical account of the flood was overlaid in the memories of many peoples with legends which express this truth. These legends are as real as the flood itself. The flood in Noah's time was not a unique event. Jesus says, "As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, when there were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." The world is now on the brink of a new catastrophe for sinners. The Bible says that this time it will be destroyed by fire. The elements will melt with a fervent heat, unquote. These words were written 2,000 years ago by Peter, the fisherman, long before anyone knew about chemical elements or the destructive power of annihilating capacity of atomic fission and its fervent heat. As Noah had a warning from God, so the church has a warning today. The world is Noah's time was delay. The world in Noah's time was destroyed, although its wickedness was not sufficient to forbid Noah's preaching. What judgment can today's world expect when, in some parts of the world, it puts a prohibition upon this warning? Mankind should not be aware of the dangers facing, or mankind should not be aware of the dangers facing the world of today. Therefore, they deny the flood of old, even at the price of denying historical evidence. There is no proof for the existence of Abraham and his descendants, say our opponents further. Has any historical excavation proved the existence of Spartacus, the leader of a revolt of slaves, a man who figures in all histories of socialism? Surely not. Certainly not. It is taken for granted that Spartacus really existed because a Roman historian wrote about him. Then why do the historians of socialism not apply the same yardstick to the biblical personalities, even if historical excavations should not prove anything about their existence? Why should they have spoken about Abraham, who lived most of his life as a nomad? We believe in his historical existence as we believe in the historical reality of Spartacus, because historians, the writers of the Bible, speak about his life and the lives of other personalities of the Old Testament. Further, all the Jews of all times have known themselves to be descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All the Arabs from the immemorial have known that Abraham was their father. All the Christians and all the Muslims of the world have always venerated Abraham as the ancestor of their faith in one single God. Should all this count for nothing? Abraham brought the cave of Machpelah for the burial of Sarah. Afterward, this cave became a family tomb. There were buried Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, and Jacob. A mosque and a synagogue now stand above this cave, and it was one of the holy places of pilgrims for the Muslims. Imagine that after a few hundred or thousand years, someone seeing the mausoleum of Lenin should say that Lenin was not a historical personality but a myth. The corpse of Lenin, it would be said, is only a wax figure. Suppose that after 2,000 years, archaeologists who had heard about Stalin should find nothing relating to him, not a corpse or even so much as a wax figure. Surely they would deny his existence. Quote, "How foolish," you say, but then the denial of Abraham's existence is also foolish. A site in Israel indicates the historicity of Abraham's grandson, the well of Jacob, where Jesus spoke with the Samaritan woman, still exists in Palestine and is covered by a little Greek church. The well itself is immediately below the high altar. But Jacob and his descendants are also not historical personages, we are told by skeptics. Either they are ignorant or else they are deliberately hiding the truth. In Tel Harari, in 1933, excavations were made by the well-known archaeologist Professor Parrott. Tel Harari is between Damascus and Mosul, in the very place from which the family of Abraham is reported to have come to Canaan. Now, the Mari civilization has been discovered there, and the Assyriologists were able to decipher a clay tablet. It was a report of Banham, an officer of the desert police, which is dated around the 17th century BC. The report has the following wording, quote, "Say to my lord this from Banham, thy servant. Yesterday I left Mari and spent the night in Zerabon. All the Benjaminites were sending fire signals. From Samanim to Elam Moloch, from Elam Moloch to Mishlam, all the Benjamite villages in the Turqua district replied with fire signals. I am not certain what these signals meant." Unquote. In addition, the chronological tables discovered in the place mention the Benjamites 3 times. Quote, "The year in which the Ahudulim went to Hen and laid hands upon the territory of the Benjamites," unquote, is an inscription from the reign of King Ahudulim. From the reign of the last monarch of Mari, we have 2 inscriptions. Quote, "The year that Zimri Lim killed the Daradim of the Benjamites," unquote, and, quote, "the year after Zimri Lim killed the Daradim of the Benjamites," unquote. Benjamin is, according to the Bible, Jacob's youngest son. How then can skeptics say that the sons of Jacob are not historical persons? The first time that the name of Israel occurs in non-biblical documents is on an inscription, now in the Cairo Museum, from a mortuary temple near Thebes, on which the victory of Pharaoh Mezemta over the Libyans is commemorated. In order to augment his triumph, other noble victories which this ruler is said to have achieved are also mentioned. The end of the hymn of the praise is as follows, quote, "Canaan is despoiled and all its evil with it. Ashkelon is taken captive. Gezer is conquered. Yanom is blotted out. The people of Israel are desolate. Israel has no offspring. Palestine has become a widow for Egypt," unquote. So the name of Israel is already historical by the year 1229 BC. The ruler of that time boasted of destroying the Jews, just as his follower Nasser boasted before he was defeated by Israel, which will never be utterly destroyed. It surely seems to be a very ridiculous thing to write a book of 700 pages to prove that over 4,000 years ago a man with the name of Abraham did not exist, that he had no descendants with the names of Isaac, Jacob, and Benjamin, and that the whole biblical story about the people of Israel is untrue. Many atheists are not interested in their own ancestors of 4,500 years ago. Why should they be interested in denying specifically that the Jews have a history dating from a man named Abraham? The denial has a deep sense. It will best be explained by a joke which must be Jewish, since we are discussing the Jews. Goldstein was riding in a train. Opposite him was another Jew, Hershkovicki. They did not know each other. Goldstein wanted to enter into a conversation, so he asked Hershkovicki, "Comrade, tell me please what time it is?" Hershkovicki did not answer. The question was repeated several times, every time in a louder voice. It did not help. In the end, Goldstein said, quote, "But comrade, I see that you have a watch on your wrist. Why don't you tell me the time?" Unquote. Hershkovicki replied, "Comrade, you are not interested in this. I surmised that you would like to chat a little bit. If I had told you that it was 9 o'clock, you would have asked, what brand of watch do you have? I would have replied, it is a Swiss gold watch. You would have answered, then you must have a high position. You could not afford such a watch otherwise. I would have replied, yes, I am a director of the Ministry of External Commerce. Then you would have asked me where I stay in Moscow. I would have answered, on street, and he names the street. You would have asked if you have a family. I would have told you that I have a wife and 3 daughters. You would have asked if by chance I had their picture with me. I would have said yes, and you would have shown me the picture. You would have liked my beautiful elder daughter Esther, and you would have asked me if I would allow you to come visit me once. Politeness would have obliged me to answer yes. You would have fallen in love with Esther and would have asked her hand in marriage. And why should I give my daughter in marriage to a man who does not even possess a watch? Ha ha, right? The existence of Abraham and his descendants must be denied, because if atheists were to admit that Abraham existed according to the biblical record and all the traditions of hundreds of millions of Jews, Christians, Muslims, we would have asked why Abraham was so conspicuous that his name should remain alive in history after 4 millennia. The only reply could be that he is famous because he believed God, followed his commands, and was ready to sacrifice even the dearest son for him. To which we would have asked whether Abraham ever met God. The answer is that he often heard the voice of God speaking to him clearly. We would be interested to know what God told him. The answer would be that among other things, God told him that he wanted to make a covenant with him. In his seed, that is, through one of his offspring, all nations would be blessed. Now, since everyone wishes to have a blessed life, we would have asked the name of this descendant of Abraham who was to impart happiness. The reply is simple. The New Testament begins by telling us that Jesus is the descendant of Abraham. We would have asked how anybody can receive blessing from him, and we would hear the message, and they would hear the message of the gospel. Jesus died on the cross for us sinners. He bore the punishment for our offenses. Whoever believes in him is cleansed from all their sins and has eternal life, now and in paradise. The authors of the Atheist Handbook therefore proceed carefully, as did Comrade Hershkovicki in The Joke. They cut the discussion short. The biblical personalities never existed. They have the watch on their wrist, but they will not say what time it is. This is the purpose also in other denials of biblical truth. This is their purpose in finding fault with the Bible and seeking contradictions in it. So cool little story, right? That kind of points to the problem. Instead of really delving down and asking the questions and really seeking answers, they just simply take a denial position. And so that is what he refers to at the end. And then he brings up some good external evidence of the Bible and characters of the Bible specifically. So, if you've ever read the Bible, and if you haven't, you should read it. I mean, it's you always, I mean, that's what I always thought. I criticized it so much back in the day that I thought one day, like, hey, maybe I'll just read the thing. And it's amazing all the places that it talks about, the languages, people groups, kings, queens, and if these things weren't had any basis in a history, then it would be pretty obvious to point out. So I kind of figure that there's so many books written against Christianity that it must be because it's quite difficult to put down Christianity. Therefore, it needs many books to be written against it to try to cover all the bases, because it's such a thorough book. Anyway, I thought it was a good chapter. Did the characters in the Bible really exist? So, hey, Ashley, hope you're doing great. Have a great day. So you guys have a good one. Great Saturday. Bye-bye.